Well, hello, my name is Greg Olson, and you're with the GROWL Agency Storytelling Series. And today we're here with the Civil Conversations Project and with the host, Wayne Hare. Hey, Wayne, how are you doing today?
Greg, I'm good. I'm doing well. It's a fine, sunny winter day in Grand Junction.
It is that also. Well, I'm excited about our guest today. He's graciously joined us from his very busy day. But before we get started, and I'll let you introduce him. But let's talk. Can you just give a little, for if we have any first-time listeners, about a little who you are and the Civil Conversation Project, and then we'll get into right into our guest.
Yeah, I'm Wayne Hare. I retired from the Park Service 6 or 7 years ago as a backcountry ranger. Yeah, I guess, long story short, the country started to divide apart, or maybe I should say continue to divide apart. That bothered me a lot, bothers me a lot. And so I started doing some writing about it. And I call it the Civil Conversations Project, trying to put out information there that would allow people to have the knowledge to be able to communicate with each other with some background rather than just emotion. And then when George Floyd died, it really kind of took off, and some other things attached themselves to this project. So here I am.
Yeah. And we have a lot of the recordings already up on our website at growlagency.com/connect, CONNEX. We've had fascinating discussions about Civil War monuments and various history with race and racism. And so I've learned a lot, Wayne. So thank you very much for being a storyteller with us. Well, let's get right into it. Wayne, why don't you introduce our guest and start having our conversation.
I will just give a very brief introduction to Chief Doug Shoemaker. He's Chief of Police here in Grand Junction, where you and I reside in Western Colorado. He's got a pretty extensive background. I think it's really I think the chief's background is unique and ideally suited to the challenges that law enforcement is facing across the country today. I know enough about Chief Shoemaker to know that we could call him Dr. Chief Shoemaker because he has an advanced degree. I'm going to let the chief just fill us in, if you would, Chief Shoemaker, on where you came from and what your background is, and International Chiefs of Police Association, that sort of thing, if you wouldn't mind, sir.
Yep. Thank you, Chief, for being on the show today. We really appreciate it. Let's tell us a little bit about yourself. And I know you've been on the force here for a little bit, and a lot of positive accolades about everything you've been doing in the community. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks for having me, and it's great to see you both. It's a pleasure to be here. So I don't go too much into my background. It's sort of funny to talk about myself, but I guess for your purposes here, this is 30 years for me in law enforcement. It doesn't seem like 30, but it has been 30, and most of those years were in Jefferson City, Missouri, where I went through the ranks before I took the job out here in Grand Junction 2.5 years ago. So feel really lucky to be out here. Great community, great area, and obviously love the area itself. So really pleased to be here. My background really is certainly in policing for all these years, but also academically, I've been able to achieve a few things, which I'm proud of those things. Got a bachelor's degree in, of all things, English Lit, master's in criminal justice, and then a doctorate in organizational leadership that I just finished this year. So I also work a lot with the International Police Chiefs Association. I happen to be one of 27 committee chairs for the organization, which is about 40,000 strong worldwide. Feel really fortunate to have the president of IACP put me in that position, and really working hard to deal with issues of where we're going in policing overall. So it's been a great career, and I look forward to the next several years as well, and certainly doing that here in Grand Junction. So thanks for letting me be here today.
Yeah, thank you. With that, Wayne, why don't we get into the show? And normally we have a lot of back and forth with that, Doug, and we're comfortable if it's not if it's not something we want to dig into, if we go a little too deep. Sometimes there might be background information we want to explore later, which we can get from you. So with that, Wayne, why don't you kick it off with some of your first questions?
Yeah, I'm going to maybe backtrack just a little bit to say
Sure.
that my years in the Park Service as a non-law enforcement backcountry ranger were in the law enforcement division, and so all of my coworkers were law enforcement, my supervisors were law enforcement, and my friends were law enforcement, and so that's kind of it just carried on. Now that I'm not in the Park Service, I still have many of those same friends. And I have friends in law enforcement in what I would call civilian agencies. And Chief, some of those people who are really, let me be very clear, they're really good people. I wouldn't be friends with them if they weren't, right? But some of them feel like there is not an actual that law enforcement has not created any problems in Black communities. They feel like it's politics has woven in there, and media, and it's just presenting an inaccurate story to the public. And so I'm curious. Do you feel, Chief, like, and then we'll kind of come back maybe to locally, but nationally, do you feel like there is a legitimate that the minority communities, Black communities in particular, that express having a problem with law enforcement in their communities? Is any of that legit, or is that are we just kind of being led down some path by I don't know, Black Lives Matter or the media?
Well, I think it's a multi-pronged answer, quite frankly. Law enforcement has had a unique history throughout its time here in the United States, and as we all kind of base our work dating back to 1829, when Sir Robert Peel founded the London Metropolitan Police and started what was called community policing way back then. The foundational principles of those beginnings began with the words, "The police are the public and the public are the police." And that was back in 1829, so nearly 200 years ago. Since that time, as policing has evolved, it's gone through a lot of stages, some of which weren't pretty. You look during the early parts of this century, and you talk about civil rights movements and things of that nature, where police, the job wasn't what it's like today, and there were some problems there, particularly with working with minority communities. So there's a story there that goes back a long time, and it's not always a pretty story to look at, but it's one we must understand, to say, all right, here's the history and how do we move forward together. I will say that there's always things with national media that doesn't necessarily ring true on some levels, because we all know that the happy stories don't sell first. And policing, everybody loves to have some sort of involvement with policing. But we've not always been our own best friends. We've many times in policing been our own worst enemies, and we've not done as good of a job of outreach or working to really understand what our communities expect from us, particularly minority communities, as to how they want to be policed. So there are a lot of challenges there in history, and our opportunity here as we move forward is to say, what's that look like, and then how do we really move forward together and have conversations, much like today, to say, how do we do better collectively, and what's that look like for everybody? So the goal, I think, now is to move forward and to try and figure out really how policing evolves. And some people would say, I suppose, that policing is going through a radical transformation. And I don't know that that's accurate. I think that it's constantly transforming if the agency is progressing anyway. For agencies that are stagnant and lie in the last 30 years, and this is how we've always done it, then I would agree that the things that are happening now are going to be radical transformations because they've been stuck in reverse or in neutral the whole time, as opposed to continuously moving forward and trying to do new things and trying to do them better. So we've not always done a great job in policing, and I think those of us in leadership positions have to acknowledge that. But by the same token, I think we also have to acknowledge that we have some opportunities to do some things and make it better.
Yeah. Good comments.
Chief, I heard you kind of allude to something that I've heard sometimes from other law enforcement officers, and that is that over time and in the history of this country, that the relationship between law enforcement and minority communities has that minority communities had some justification for speaking out against police presence in their community or the way police were treating them or so on and so forth. And that some of what we're dealing with today or I've actually heard expressed that all of what we're dealing with today is really, kind of still trying to overcome the past. But I don't, is that what you're saying? I don't know if it is or not. I don't think it is what you're saying. Could you clarify that for me a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I think when you look at the past and you look at how law enforcement has evolved, there have always been law enforcement professionals doing good things, but there have also been periods in our time as law enforcement within the United States where it hasn't been that great at all, and challenges have come particularly in our communities of color, for example. So I think those things do build up to where we are now. These aren't just overnight things that just happen. I think there are reasons for them happening, and I think a lot of those reasons are the fact that there's not enough outreach to talk about, how we police our communities and what the expectations are. Because as we've seen in surveys, minority communities want to be policed, but they want to have an understanding as to what the expectations are and have a voice in that. And I think that's appropriate. Absolutely. I think that's what we should all work toward in the first place. The issue is some law enforcement agencies, and I think through history have failed to perhaps listen and take that into account when they do those types of things and when they administer policing. So, it's a mixed bag, and you can't, if you paint it with a broad brush, then that's unfair to people that are doing the right thing at the right times all the time. But I think acknowledgement of some of the challenges we've had in our past is certainly part of this.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Chief. Let's circle around to this community, Grand Junction, Colorado. I don't have the stats. I think you do, but this is predominantly, we're kind of a small to mid-sized city in the midst of a very rural, Colorado area. To get to a big city from Grand Junction, you have to drive a long way in any direction. Agriculture, oil and gas and agriculture have been probably the bedrock of this area, and obviously agriculture before oil and gas. So it is predominantly a white area. I would say that our largest minority group is probably Hispanics, and then Black Americans are a very small part of the community. So having said all that, for whatever reasons I said it, how are relationships between the police department here and the community, and then specifically the minority communities?
Well, you're right in terms of it's a mid-sized city in a rural setting, in that we are so distant from Denver or Salt Lake. And as a matter of fact, we're the largest city on I-70 between Denver and Salt Lake. So it's a ways to go anywhere that's a quote unquote big city. That presents some unique challenges and opportunities, particularly in a community that is probably roughly 80+% white in terms of our makeup. And you're right, the next largest group of individuals would be our Latino population, our Hispanic community, which is roughly around 13 or 14%, I think. So as we look at our community and we look at how we police, I will say that through the years, I think we've done a really good job working with all members of our community. I say all this with the caveat that, of course, there's always room for improvement with everything. But I think that, how we negotiated this year in particular with George Floyd, and how we've gotten through some things has been different than maybe how other agencies have, because we've built some level of trust that leads to this point. Trust building is not for the time of the crisis, it's for the time well before. And you build up those levels of trust and have conversations. As we talk about our Latino population, for example, our agency has specifically conducted several outreach programs. We had what was called the Law Enforcement Latino Alliance, which was a cooperative effort between us and various law enforcement agencies, along with the members of our Latino community, to talk about how we work together, how we bridge those gaps, and find solutions to figure out what that looks like for how we police the Latino population. Those were successful, but as with everything, those things need to evolve, which led us to having conversations, smaller conversations with different groups within our Latino population. Within our agency alone, we've had, I think, 3 now graduations in classes of our Latino Citizens Police Academy, specific to our Latino population, to have outreach and talk about why we do what we do. And I think that story is very important. Our Black population is significantly lower than what I'm used to, being from Jefferson City, Missouri, where we were 23% African American. And our largest number of African Americans within our community certainly fall well within the confines of the student population at CMU, our local university, as opposed to within the community. So everything is different in terms of how we build those relationships. But for the most part, I think we've done really well. Again, with the caveat that there's always room for improvement, but overall, I'm pleased with that. But I attribute the culture of the organization and how we train and who we hire as having a big play in that.
Chief, you and I spoke about the culture of your organization just a few days ago, and the values that you hold, actually, that you try to push out to the troops. Could you talk about what that culture and what those values are, and then if you think that if you think if you could transpose that culture and those values to a city that has a much larger African American population, if you think that would be a step in the right direction.
Well, I'll try and do my best with what I think you're asking on that. But in terms of our culture, I credit certainly Chief Camper, John Camper, who's now the director of CBI, and who was the chief before I was here. Chief Camper was here for roughly 8 years. Initially, there was a few challenges when he started, but I think John tried to foster a culture of really true community policing and getting to people's why as to why they do this job. Because it does take a certain type of individual to want to be a police officer, particularly in today's culture. So that said, I think that the groundwork was laid there, and a lot of that has trickled through the organization to accept others who want to be progressive in how they do things, who want to do it for the right reasons, who are ethical, who possess integrity and have some level of compassion in why they do this job. Because this is not this is not a robotic type of job. We deal with human emotions and human issues on a daily, hourly basis all the time. And so we have to have people that understand how to relate best to those challenges within the community. And I think we continue that to this day, certainly. And we continue to even push forward with those types of things. Law enforcement's changed a lot since when I was hired. In terms of when we first were back in 1991, hiring people looked a lot different than it does today. And when we hire people on board, we want to bring them onto our agency, specifically what we're looking for people that know how to communicate. That's a major play in things because they have to be able to talk their way through things to de-escalate situations more often than not. And to just understand why they're responding to certain calls and figure out what people are expecting. If you transpose what we're doing here to another agency or to another city, I think it just boils down to communication and talking. We are not, nor have we ever attempted to be an occupying force in an area. That's not what we do. Take case in point, the protests that followed from George Floyd earlier this year here in Grand Junction. And you may have noticed, if you're paying attention, that when we had those issues, we didn't have officers standing on a line and riot gear. That was purposeful, specifically to try and talk to folks that had challenges or issues, maybe with policing as a profession, maybe with something else. It wasn't with us and it wasn't personal, but we certainly had conversations with people that had different views than we have, that we hold. But we did it on a level that we weren't, like I mentioned earlier, an occupying force there. We had no incidents throughout all the protests of any issues of property destruction or violence, anything of that nature. And I think it's because we were able to just have conversations with people and talk about our perspectives, their perspectives, and then how we meet in the middle to work this thing through. And I think that's paid off really well for us.
So to be, completely forthright and open and honest with our audience, I went to a memorial service for George Floyd, and I guess I don't know how many Black people we have in the Valley, but they were all at that memorial service, all 20 of us, plus a lot of white people too, and I had zero doubt that it would be anything other than a peaceful memorial. I don't know if it even entered my mind that there might be some violence or anything like that. But what I did notice was that there was only 2 police officers there in uniform. Maybe the chief had some undercover folks there, but there was only two police in uniform, and one of them was a woman. And so it was a man and a woman in uniform, and they stood about 1.5 blocks to 2 blocks away from the memorial. And clearly they were had no designs at all in stirring the pot, and I was just I took note of that. Somebody had told them, stand, here are the 2 of you that are going, and stand 1.5 blocks to 2 blocks away. And so I sent an email to the chief. I said, man, I love living someplace where this is the kind of police department we have. And he responded. So the chief and I have had correspondence since then. So he's right in what he just said about coming in as an occupying force. But that does bring me circling around, Chief, to white communities, by and large, I think, feel like the police are their friends, and they're in their communities to serve and protect, like it says on the side of most patrol cars around the country, I think. Black communities don't feel like that. Black communities feel like it's an occupying force, and that police are there to contain them in their communities. So I guess elaborating upon that a little bit is you talked about you feel like police that minority communities do want to have a police presence, and that's true. You know, in this era of defund the police, the perception is being perpetrated that Black communities want to defund the police and not have police. But if you listen to the interviews and listen to the people on the street, they're saying exactly the opposite. You know, no, we want to have a police presence, and in fact, we might even want to have a more of a police presence. But you were saying earlier that that minority communities, and really we're actually going to talk about African American communities, Black American communities, do want to have a police presence, but what they want is to be listened to. But some people would say what they want is to not be treated violently. What they want is to not be shot and killed out of proportion to the white community. If they're from New York, they would say what we want is to be able to walk down the street doing nothing illegal and not be stopped and leaned against the wall, feet spread, and frisked. So I think what I'm asking, Chief, is that sense of the police being an occupying force in some Black communities. Is there any truth in that? Is there any validity in that? Yeah, I guess that's my question.
Sure. Well, you know, I provide perspective from a realistic point of experience, and my experiences are with two police agencies, and that's Jefferson City, Missouri, and Hare. And so it's, you know, I'm not a part of NYPD. I certainly know some NYPD folks. I know how hardworking and the job they do and the job they're up against, particularly right now. So, you know, I think blanket statements can be dangerous because I do remember specifically working within my previous agency as a recruit officer, a newer officer, and being assigned to an area that had a much higher African-American population than the other districts within the city. But quite frankly, it was all about relational policing. It was about getting out of the car and talking to people and making contacts. And by that, I mean, how's it going? You know, I'm officer such and such, and this is kind of my district, and you'll see me around. If there's problems or something, let me know. And that's how it all starts. And then eventually when they see you walking around and just talking to kids or talking to whomever with no real, I don't have an agenda there. I'm not trying to, you know, shake people down or anything, but as you walk around and just talk to people, eventually you start building trust within those communities. And after a while, you become the officer that they trust. So if there is an issue within the community, they'll be the first one to tell you, and then you can deal with those issues because they don't want to live in a crime zone either. Yeah. They want to be safe and have the right to be safe in their neighborhoods, just like anybody else. So why not try and figure out what that looks like for everybody and how we best police? But again, it goes back to the conversations as to how we do what we do and why we do it. And the transparency of use of force or of policies or those types of things, you know, are all really important and always really have been. One thing I think as police across the country, I think we've done a very poor job on, quite frankly, is telling our story. For years, and I worked in media relations. I was the public information officer for Jefferson City, Missouri, and actually was the elected vice chair of the International Police Chiefs PIO section, public information section, for 2 years. And one thing that we've failed terribly on is talking about the good things that we do and the why of what we do when we do. Because once you explain things as to why are there two officers on a traffic stop? Well, here's why we do that. And so when you explain the why to people, oh, now I get it. And for many years, policing was, well, because we're the police and that's why, and that's all you need to know. It's like the parent who tells the child the child says, why can't I go down the street and hang out with Jimmy? And you're like, because I said so, and I'm the dad. And it's not a reason, right? And in policing, we owe those reasons to say, okay, well, here's kind of the why. And I think that's something that we're working on, that we continue to get better at. But you know, a lot of those positive interactions, then the problem is they're As you look at almost, a million police within the country or thereabouts, and so many agencies and the interactions we have on a daily basis, we don't see a lot of the positive things that happen. And that's a real challenge for us, particularly as we continue to recruit and try and bring people into the good of law enforcement. Are there problems? Absolutely. We've got some people that shouldn't be cops. They should probably be in jail. And that's the problem of rooting those folks out or never letting them get in the first place. Thus the hiring process that we have locally, which is extremely strict. Is it 100% perfect? No, nothing is, because of human nature and other human factors, but we're really good at it, quite frankly.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that are going on there and a lot of things into play, but understanding the community that you serve is essential.
I'm going to add in a question here. We're going to wrap up here in just a couple minutes, and I'm going to let Wayne formulate his thoughts for another question. I have a question for you. And then as we close out, if you think of a couple points that you want to clarify, Doug, for our listeners as we close out our talk today. So just to give you kind of a heads up, my question is kind of around, how do you teach or police academy? I grew up with a father in law enforcement as well. I know he went through constant training. I didn't get to go to those training, of course. But I know that there's always all kinds of training happening. So I think about, you read things about implicit bias training, which I was like, okay, what is this about? And it gets more complicated because people want to be police officers. How do you teach about race or racism or, and those things? Those to me are challenges that, you have all these things that you have to teach that maybe we didn't have to cover. Maybe my father was going through law enforcement training and now you do. Is that something of the future, or how do you see that happening? Much like we're having this discussion now, but now you have to put that into an academy or ongoing training, I guess.
Well, it's already in an academy, has been for some time. But that said, I think locally, and Wayne and I've had the conversation, and I've mentioned it to some folks that I've worked with at CMU to say that I'm not a fan of the current standard, as I feel it's not adequate. That's just me talking, and I certainly want to speak to the other chiefs, but nonetheless, for our agency, I don't think it's adequate. So if we look at bias, let's be honest, we all have biases.
Yeah.
To say that you're unbiased is just to be in absolute denial. It's how we work through those biases to still do our jobs and to do them appropriately and ethically and professionally. And so admitting that we have them and then figuring out, okay, this is how it impacts me. And then how do I get through that to make sure that I don't let that hurt what I'm trying to accomplish as a professional law enforcement officer, both is the biggest challenge. So for us, it's an increase in the hours and it's a change in how we've approached the training. And I see other agencies in the state, and quite frankly, with the passage of Senate Bill 217 this year, that's being changed too. Every agency ultimately has the responsibility to do what they feel is right for their agency, try and make some positive steps.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that because one thing since knowing Wayne in that whole bias training, I really didn't grasp that, being how I was raised. I just didn't think I had any of those kind of bias, but really Wayne helped me uncover some biases I may have had, just thinking about this and not understanding. So I just bring that up because I'm always learning. And I think running a business, it's much easier than what you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but we still have to, how do we lead by example? How do we educate? How do we move forward with that? Wayne, I want to wrap up with one more question because I want to let the chief get on to his next task. So go ahead, Wayne.
Maybe you feel lucky, but I think the community is lucky too, to have, to be, as far as I know, fairly divorced from the problems and the issues that we're reading about across the country. So I know that I know I'm grateful for that sort of community policing or whatever it is that we have here that it just seems like there's a good coming together of citizens and police. I guess I don't know that for sure, but that's just my observation. And I could certainly have this conversation for hours. There's so much to unpackage here when it comes to Black communities and police, although maybe not so much in Grand Junction, but we don't have, and you don't have hours and hours. So I'm going to just wrap up and just thank you very much for being here and taking the time. I got to think that being chief of police in a mid-sized city doesn't give you a lot of downtime to drink coffee and to chat on podcasts. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for letting me be here. And I didn't even drink any coffee during the podcast. So there you go.
Okay.
Chief, I really appreciate you taking time. Thank you for all you do and your officers. And it's a wonderful time take time with you today and just learn a little bit more about what you're thinking and help our listeners. And my job is really, I'm a Wayne handler at this point. I try to break them down into 30-minute time slots to have very hard, kind of sometimes difficult conversations, which is what civil conversations is all about. Our job is to help people think. We talk about biases, we talk about racism, we talk about policing, we talk about all different things out there. And we're not here to really, be the experts or to solve it, but we want to bring community leaders like yourself into the conversation to help us understand the things that you may be facing and what you're learning like that. So any closing thoughts, Chief, before we sign off here?
No, I appreciate it. For those of you that don't know, Wayne and I actually worked together on the Grand Valley Task Force with the Law Enforcement Working Group. Wayne has agreed wholeheartedly and excitedly to be my co-chair on that. And so I appreciate, Wayne's questions and involvement, and that it means a lot. So thanks for letting me be here.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to another conversation with you in the future. With that, thank you and have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thanks so much, Doug.